Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Conor Graves Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be continuing with our Disney series. In today's video we're going to be looking at none other than the Aristocats from 1970. So if you like what you've seen already, don't forget obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also don't forget to check out our many other videos which we've covered all the Disney films during the lifetime of Walt Disney. So now we're going to be continuing in the era after his death. So, for those of you who have seen the videos already, you'll know that we have it split into 6 different parts. So we have the story of the story of the creator, the story of the studio, the themes and history, the legacy, and any notable lines and notable effects within the film. So, without further ado, we're going to dive straight now into the story of the story. So buckle up and let's go for the ride. So the 1970 film is based off an original story by 3 Disney writers. So this is Tom McGowan, Tom Rowe, and Harry Title. So without further ado, we're going to dive straight now into the plot of the Aristocats. So our story starts with Madame Bonfamille, who is a rich heiress with 4 cats. So we have Duchess and her 3 kittens, Toulouse, Marie, and Berlioz, as well as her loyal butler, Edgar. So Madame Bonfamille, she is waiting on her lawyer, Georges, who is a really funny old man, and she is waiting on him so that she can write her will, in which she decides that upon her death, she will give her entire fortune to her cats. Now this obviously outrages the loyal Edgar, who is eavesdropping, and he can't be bothered to wait until after the cats die before he inherits, so he hatches a cunning plan. Now in the meantime, the kittens are playing, they're doing some artwork, and they are practicing their scales and their arpeggios, which is a really great song. But now it's time for feeding, and Edgar gives them milk laced with sleeping pills. And once they're asleep, he tries to drown them in the river before 2 dogs end up chasing him away. Now the cats wake up, they're afraid, they're confused, they don't really know what's happened. But this is where they end up meeting Thomas O'Malley, who comes with his own theme song and also comes with a lot of very smooth pickup lines. Now when he realizes that Duchess has kittens, at first he's a bit deterred. But then he decides to help them to get back to Paris, and so he goes along the journey with them. Now back at the house, Madame Bonfamille is obviously very distraught, whilst Edgar is very happy, until he realises that he's left his belongings behind, which could serve as evidence to the police, so he goes to retrieve them. Now back to the cats, and they've gone along a very treacherous journey, and Marie ends up falling in the river. So Thomas goes after her, but ends up needing rescuing himself from 2 English geese on their trip across France. Now they happen to be going to Paris to meet their drunken Uncle Waldo, so the cats follow them on their way. And when they get to Paris, they are introduced to O'Malley's swinging crew, who sing Everybody Wants to Be a Cat, which is obviously a really great song. But after this, Duchess laments at the fact that Thomas and her will have to part, as she must return to Madame Bonfamille, and Thomas must return to the streets. Now the next morning, they're back at the house, but unbeknownst to them, Edgar, who has obviously been plotting against them, and they were unaware of this all this time, he captures them and puts them in a sack. So they go and ask Rockford the mouse to go and get O'Malley to rescue him. But O'Malley sends Rockford to go and get the gang of alley cats, who almost end up eating Rockford before he finally remembers O'Malley's name, and the whole gang ends up coming to save Duchess and the kittens. Now Edgar plans to send the cats to Timbuktu, but they end up outsmarting him, and instead he ends up going there. So now the film ends, you have Thomas, who's now part of the family, and Madame Bonfamille, she now puts in her will that the house is going to be turned into a refuge for all the alley cats of Paris. And so the film ends happily ever after. So with that, obviously that's the plot of Aristocats, and if you haven't seen it already, spoiler alert, but you know, it's your fault, like grow up, it came out in 1970, so you know, get a life, right? But still, that kind of covers the story of the story. So now we have to talk about the story of the creative process that went into the making of this great masterpiece. So on the 9th of December 1961, this is where Disney asked for Harry Title and for Tom McGowan to create a story about animals for a live action TV program called The Wonderful World of Colour. And by New Year's Day 1962, McGowan had already come up with a few stories to do with different animals. In particular, he liked the idea of some cats who were based in New York. However, Harry Title, because it's around the time that 101 Dalmatians had just been released, he decided that actually it would be better if it had a foreign setting, yeah. So obviously 101 Dalmatians is set in London, so he thought, right, maybe instead of New York, we can have this set in somewhere like Paris. Now, originally the story was going to be more centered around a butler and a maid, and basically the story was going to be about the conflict between them. So it's still going to be very similar in terms of, there's a bunch of cats which end up inheriting a great fortune, but the conflict was more going to be between this butler and this maid, and obviously like their plan to kill the cats. But this ended up being rejected by August of 1961. So what the two writers did is that they basically went around the studios, right? So Disney Studio had rejected them. So instead they decided to talk to the big man himself. So this is Walt Disney, of course. So what they did is that they slipped the treatment of it into an envelope and gave it to Walt Disney. And whilst he was on his flight back from Portugal, he read over the script with them. And this is where he made some revisions. Now, Tom Rowe, who is also one of the writers for this, he'd written his own kind of version of this. He didn't like the revisions that Walt Disney had suggested. However, Harry Title was basically like, come on, the big man himself, he's okayed this, right? If he's suggesting it, we can't really override him. This is the only way the film's going to be made. And then also as well, Harry Title, he's also one who suggested to Disney that instead of it being a live action film, it should be an animated film. Now, the idea for this ended up being shelved in favour of Jungle Book, and so the film kind of got put on ice for a few years. And during this time, this is where Harry Title ended up being replaced by Winston Hibler, who we've mentioned in previous videos as well, so definitely go and check those out. So in 1966, Walt Disney assigned Ken Anderson to basically sort things out, and so what he did is he went through the script, he neatened things up, and he also made the script a lot more cat-centric. So as a result of all this, Walt Disney ended up approving this, and this ended up being the very last film which Walt Disney had an active part in, right? So it really is the end of an era of this film. So obviously all the films up to this point, Walt Disney had an active part in. Everything afterwards would be, the kind of a post-Walt world, right? So obviously things had to wait until the end of Jungle Book in 1967, but as soon as that was over, work on this began. And then the final thing to kind of say is that the role of the butler and the maid end up being changed about. So the maid was got rid of, and so you end up having the butler, who ends up being Edgar, and he is just the central villain within the story. And much like 101 Dalmatians, the storyline was basically going to be an adventure. So that was kind of how it was going to be laid out. So of course that covers the story of the creative process that went into the making of the film. But now we have to talk about the story of the studio. So Ken Anderson, he spent 18 months designing the characters for it. And in regard to Thomas O'Malley, who I reckon was named after J. Pat O'Malley, right, who we've covered in other videos as well. With regard to Thomas's character, originally he was going to be a tabby cat. However, Wolfgang Reifman, who is the director, he had remembered all the difficulties which had come from animating Shere Khan in the Jungle Book as a result of all the stripes that he had. And so they decided that instead of Thomas O'Malley being a tabby cat, he was just going to be a regular cat in order to save money and time. And then also as well, we should say with regard to the music for this, this was the very last film which the Sherman Brothers did the music for. And just like in the Jungle Book with Terry Gilkinson, so he had written the lyrics for the Bare Necessities song. And in this one, he wrote the lyrics for the Thomas O'Malley song. So in both cases, this is sung by Phil Harris. So now talking about the casting for it, so obviously as we just said, Phil Harris is the voice of Thomas O'Malley, and then you have Ava Gabor, who is the voice of the Duchess, and she's also the voice of one of the characters in The Rescuers. Talking about the kittens, you have 3 kittens, so this is voiced by Gary Dubin, Liz English, and also Dean Clark, although they're quite minor actors and they weren't in anything else that was notable. Similarly, you also have the voice of Edgar, and he is also voiced by a very minor actor, and this is Roddy Maud Roxby. And also with regard to Scat Cat, he is voiced by Scatman Crothers. So you ever seen The Shining? He is the black guy in that, which is probably the role which he's most famous for. And then also with regard to the Chinese cat, he is done by Paul Winchler, and he is the voice of Tigger in the Winnie the Pooh series. Also with regard to the English cat, this is voiced by Lord Tim Hudson, and he is the voice of Dizzy the Vulture in the Jungle Book, which we just covered. Definitely check that out. And then also you have Phil Ravenscroft, who is the voice of the Russian cat in this, and he also appears in Lady and the Tramp. You also have Sterling Holloway, who is the voice of Rockford, and obviously he's in many other films as well, which we've covered already, as well as Bill Thompson, who is the voice of Uncle Waldo in this, and obviously again he is in many other films as well, so definitely go and check out our previous videos. And then finally we have Hermione Baddeley, who is the maid in Mary Poppins, but in this she is surprisingly the voice of Madame Bonfamille, which I was quite surprised by because, you know, her accent normally is like quite a working class accent and stuff. So the fact that she was able to pull off a very upper class accent in a very convincing way to the extent that you wouldn't even notice it was her voice, I think that's absolutely brilliant, and it shows what a great actor she was. And then also as well, there was many other people within this who we don't have time to go through now, but that summarized the casting for the film. Now talking about the themes and the history of it, I suppose that because it's an original story, there's not a whole lot of themes within this. It's quite a very simple film. The only thing to kind of mention is that the setting of it, which is in Belle Epoque France, is quite interesting. So the Belle Epoque, or the so-called Beautiful Age, this was the time at the turn of the last century where you had high levels of inequality. So you had some people who were very, very rich, and you had a lot of people who were very, very poor. And so the kind of class divisions within this are quite apparent. So obviously you have Madame Bonfamille, who lives in a very fancy neighborhood, very nice house, etc., etc. And then you obviously have all the kind of like poor people, right? So you have the alley cats, and also as well you have Edgar. So it also is quite a kind of critique on capitalism in a way, although at the same time it's also an endorsement of capitalism. And what I mean by that is the fact that she gives inheritance to the cats first over her loyal butler. Like, what have the cats done for her? Given her some emotional support, but the butler has served her loyally all these years. He's done so much for her. So why does he have to wait until the cats die, right? So it kind of is interesting how she ends up prioritizing the cats over a human being, right? And this is something which ended up being critiqued a lot by the Soviets. So obviously this being the Cold War, you have like East versus West and stuff. So if you look at Soviet propaganda cartoon The Millionaire, which came out around this time, so like the late 50s, early 60s, this actually is very much parallel to this in the sense of the end up having a very rich heiress. She dies and leaves the whole fortune to her bulldog, right? So the Soviets critique this kind of thing. But in this, it's almost a glorification of it because the cats are seen as the heroes, and Edgar, he is seen as the villain, even though the real villain probably is actually Madame Bonfamille, because why is she giving all this fortune to the cats? But that's just my take anyway. But anyway, that covers the themes and the history. So now we have to talk about the legacy of the film. So it had a $4 million budget, which is obviously quite low, and we'll talk about that a bit later in terms of like the visual effects, etc. But still, the film was very, very, very successful. It seemed around this time that Disney had really cracked the formula in terms of what people like. They was like, right, if we make a film about animals, people will come and see it, right? So they have very low budget, but then it's just about animals, and so it really seems to pay off for them. So it cost $4 million, like we said, but in the US and Canada alone, by 1972, it already made $10.1 million. It was the most popular film in Britain, France, and Germany in 1971, and also worldwide, it made $28 million at the box office. And throughout its entire lifetime, the gross figure that it has generated is $191 million. So obviously it's a very, very popular film. It's a great film to watch. If you haven't seen it already, I don't know where you've been, definitely go and check the film out. But now that kind of covers the legacy of it, and we have to move to the final bit, which is talk about the notable lines and notable effects. So talk about the notable effects first. Like we said, there aren't any really, and that's kind of as a result of it being such a low budget. The only thing I will say is that the shots of Paris end up being quite nice, and as well as some of the sequences within the Everybody Wants to Be a Cat song. So that's quite interesting as well, like you have different lights and different colors, etc., etc. But other than that, the film is quite plain. Yeah, the level of detail is quite plain, but again, this era of Disney films, they were focused more on the actual story rather than on how it actually looked. So if you compare films from the 1960s and obviously this like the early 70s, you compare the quality of these films to the quality that they had in the 40s and 50s, you know, it really pales in comparison. But anyway, that covers that. And now talking about the notable lines within the film. So you obviously have this.
Don't panic, Edgar. I'm pulling onward. Am I going too fast for you, Edgar?
Oh, please, I hope.
And you have this.
Yes, I can't wait. And each cat has 9 lives. That's 4 times 12, and multiplied by 9 times. No, it's less than that. Anyway, it's much longer than I'd ever live.
And you have this.
Okay, let's charge.
Wait a minute, I'm the leader. I'm the one that says when we go. Here we go. Charge!
And you have this.
Ooh, why your eyes are like sapphires, sparkling so bright.
How romantic. Sissy stuff.
And you have this.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
3, 4, 5.
And also you have this.
Shirley! Shirley!
Oh, Uncle Waldo, you're just too much. You mean he's had too much?
So as you can see, it's an absolutely great film. If you haven't watched it already, I highly recommend. And another thing that I really highly recommend that you do is that you hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also don't forget to check out all of our other videos from this great playlist. You will not be disappointed. And also stay tuned for our next video, which is going to be on Robin Hood from 1973. So this is now the very first film which is going to be in this post-Walt world. But yeah, you're still going to enjoy it nonetheless. And in the meantime, have a great day and bye.